is on.
Test, 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 test. Let's test, 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 test. It's still not working. Hold on. Okay, now you can hear me. Excellent. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I'm always, as always, your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist and Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am sorry, I have no idea why that happened. Besides that, computers hate me. So tonight's episode is going to be cannibalism. I'm going to get a little into the history, get into what's going on today. Because believe it or not, there are a few cultures here and there that still seem to have a form of cannibalism, as well as serial killers and things like that that still get into it. What's interesting is it's more pervasive, even in Western. People tend to think when you think cannibalism, you think of some tribe down in the Caribbean or in a remote African jungle or something like that that gets up to it. But it's been more pervasive in Western civilization than you might think. Some of the stuff I found there is really particularly interesting, in fact. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the direction I see the show going from here. Because the thing I'm running into is I'm having a little bit of trouble thinking of directly paranormal topics to talk about that I haven't already covered a million times. I mean, how many episodes can I make about vampires and ghosts and things of that nature? So I don't want to stop doing the show. I absolutely love the show. And I love hanging out with everybody and chatting. So I'm thinking about broadening the show's horizons a little. Getting into like some weird history, getting into things that aren't necessarily technically paranormal. Though many of them will be paranormal adjacent. Like cannibalism isn't paranormal. It's something we understand. It's something that actually happens. But it certainly has a paranormal connotations and associations. One of the other topics I'm currently researching, which is just bizarre in some of the things I'm finding out about it, is the history of bogus medical remedies, what we call snake oil or quack remedies. Because let me put it like that, to give you a little spoiler about what's coming next week or week after. Eternal poop pills. Good question, Sassanage. I don't really cover UFOs. I have an intense personal dislike for the UFO phenomenon. Which isn't to say that I don't believe that UFOs are real. Obviously, I mean, even the federal government at this point has admitted UFOs exist. But I'm not convinced that what people see and call a UFO as aliens, for example. Because, there's an excellent point Neil deGrasse Tyson makes on the subject of, do UFOs exist? Yes, absolutely. If you go out in the sky, outside tonight, look up and see something flying by and you don't know what it is, you've just seen a UFO. But the key part of UFO is unidentified. The minute you go, it has to be X, you're not talking about UFO anymore. You need to back up your claim that it's X. Could some of them be alien spacecraft? Sure. How do you know that? And hi, the cat Nat. But I think there are other explanations. And actually, I could probably do an episode on that in the near future. Certainly, there's a lot of overlap between the UFOs and direct paranormal. I'll also say, in my experience, I've been doing paranormal radio for a very long time. Some of the craziest people you'll ever meet are in the UFO business. alien abductees, ufologists, the whole 9 yards, are some of the craziest, most out there people in the paranormal community. There's at least one I can certainly recommend. He's done 2 books, and I've interviewed him back during the original radio show. I'd love to have him back on, but I couldn't find him. I contacted his publisher; they can't even find him. There's a guy by the name of Kurt Southerly. He was a reporter, and he worked for the Air Force. He's a very rational, down-to-earth kind of dude. And one of the things I liked about him is he was the first to say, yeah, you know what? He thought alien spacecraft was coming here. But he didn't necessarily think every report of a UFO that was unexplainable by the government was aliens. You know, if you asked him, could it be, spirits? Could it be, somebody called in when we had him on the show one time and asked him if he thought that maybe UFOs were actually the work of Satan and his demons trying to deceive people. And Kurt's answer was, I really don't know. It could be. Because Kurt had never sat down and had a conversation with an alien, so he didn't feel qualified to definitively say one way or the other what it was. He had his own opinions on the subject, which again, he thought at least some of them were aliens, but he also thought some of them were some type of spirit being or some other phenomenon that we'd call by other names and seen in other ways that was manifesting in a new way. This is one of the things I always liked about him. But anyway, that's where the show's going. We get into some wider and weirder topics because there's a lot of really fascinating history that you weren't taught about in history class. Some of which we're going to get into tonight. Some of the history of where the word cannibal comes from. And the hypocrisy in who popularized it is really quite interesting. And I'm betting some of you guys know about at least some of it because my audience tends to be made up of a lot of very intelligent people. But I think some of it may be surprising. So the first thing to understand about cannibalism is it's been around for a very long time. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about a couple of cannibalistic groups the Greeks had come in contact with. What's interesting here is that Herodotus isn't always the most reliable source. He tended to make up some of the cultures he was talking about, and he reported on some of the others fairly accurately. What's interesting here is he reported on a couple of cultures that had a type of cannibalism a lot of people don't normally think about when you think about cannibalism. When I say cannibal to you, a lot of you probably have a very specific image in your mind. Those tribes with the bones in their nose, the big dishes, and in their lips and things like that. They go out and kill people in war and then eat the bodies. And that's not untrue. There are plenty of groups throughout history that did that. That's what's called exocannibalism. There's also what's called endocannibalism. Endocannibalism is much more personal. And as far as I understand, there are at least a few remote groups practicing this today. Humans have a lot of rituals, as you all know, regarding how they treat the dead. Some of those rituals actually involve cannibalism. Now, what I'm talking about here isn't what you usually think of as cannibalism, where it's somebody trapped, your enemy in a war or something of that nature. This is mom dies. And to honor mom, you eat her, or dad, or your uncle, or whoever. You devour her flesh. What's particularly interesting about Herodotus writing about this practice is he's very conventionally Greek, and in Greek culture was very much, you die, your body needs to be cremated. And that is what must be done. He's actually fairly respectful in how he describes these groups that use cannibalism as their form of funerary practice, which is somewhat unusual for the time period and for the authors that we're talking about. And you find this kind of practice through the ancient world, where again it was a funeral rite. It was a way of bonding with the dead instead of an act of violence. And it's still practiced in some remote parts of the world today. Um, there's of course also exocannibalism, which is what most of you are thinking of when I talk about cannibals, unless you're thinking about serial, which is also for that matter the type usually seen in serial killers. And we'll be getting into those a little later, even though they're a little different than historic cannibalism as a historical phenomenon. Um, but the practice of eating enemies killed in battle is also pretty common. Um, Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, both there are reports from from various groups, the Christian groups invaded by those people who wrote about them eating the dead. There's rumors that propped up in history of the Vikings doing it. Usually, what you find here is there is almost there's an interesting element to that as well. And yes, Vita Navitas, we are absolutely getting into medieval corpse medicines. You're absolutely right there. It is a fascinating subject. And it does relate to this. But in fact, this idea of eating, usually there are cultures that ate most, if not all, of dead enemies. But there's also a lot of cultures where you might drink the blood of the dead, or eat their heart, or their brain, or another symbolic organ. And the idea there was that by doing that, you took in the strength of your enemy. And it's hard to say how widespread that was, but we know for certain that it happened. One of the groups researching this I found very interesting, because what originally inspired this topic was watching a really good live stream between Virgo Triad and Chuck Chase's The Facts about various native cultures, and talking about the fact that, yes, some of them did in fact practice cannibalism. One of the Native American tribes that is actually pretty well documented practice cannibalism. Well, there's some controversy over this, because I mean no disrespect to indigenous people of the Americas, but the reality is they were people, and like everyone else, there are good sides and bad sides, things that they did that are morally questionable. The modern Americans have a romanticized view of the indigenous people in some ways that is both is factually inaccurate and really kind of racist. I'm not saying that they were terrible people by any means. I'm just saying, again, they were people. They did good things, they did bad things. You can't just say, oh, they didn't do that because they were so ideal. Because the reality is we found evidence in a lot of the southern parts of the United States, Texas, New Mexico, areas like that, among the tribe known as the Anunnaki, that, yeah, they actually did practice cannibalism. We found a whole new way of, there's a couple of tests that they look at on human remains to judge if the person was eaten. The meat being stripped away, signs of use of knives and tools, and things of that nature, being found in particular patterns and things like that. One of the things with the Anunnaki that they discovered this for the first time, and it's since been borne out, is that there's a very specific where you'll find on the bones of people who were eaten, because they would use the big bones like the femur to stir the pot. So there's this polish almost that you'll find on the bones in a very specific pattern, which is a sign of cannibalism. An anthropologist studying remains of, archaeology is a type of anthropology. And Vita, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. But it's since been borne out that, yes, this is a sign that somebody was eaten. How widespread? The other question rapidly becomes how widespread it was, and it's hard to say. A lot of the records of this kind of thing that we have are from European invaders, and the Europeans weren't, or for that matter, with some of the Native American tribes, the records of other Native tribes in the area that were at war with these groups. So Enemies tend to exaggerate, for obvious reasons, exaggerate the misdeeds of each other to make themselves sound like they're more morally upright. You see this throughout history, and this leads to a really interesting point that ties into what you were saying, Vita, about the medieval corpse medicines. So, where does the word cannibal come from? That's a pretty good question, I think. And the answer surprised me. Although, again, I have smart listeners, so I'm willing to bet I wouldn't be surprised if some of you know. But when Columbus came to the United States, not the United States, excuse me, came to the Americas, he ran into various tribes there. And some of the tribes that he ran into told him legends and rumors of another tribe called the Carib. And the Carib were supposedly cannibals and were feared by the other tribes that Columbus came in contact with. Columbus reported this back to Europe, and the European nobility, Queen Isabella and things like that, got very freaked out and quickly passed a law that any group found to be practicing cannibalism could be enslaved. Somewhere in this process, Carib became Canniba. You stick an L on Canniba, and you go from you get cannibal. That's where we get the word cannibal. That sounds about right. Vita said Maoris consumed their enemies as part of their right as the winner in battle. A Maori chief brought to London in 1818 and missed his flesh feasts. But unfortunately, here's what happens: is Columbus, of course, was very greedy. He came to the U.S., into the Americas, looking for gold. The tribes that he came in contact with didn't have an exceptionally high amount of gold, which angered him. And he quickly turned these laws about cannibalism to his advantage and using them as an excuse for the enslavement and genocide that would come after. Here's the hypocritical part of all of this. There is a medicine we have records of being used in 15th century Europe. This medicine was so common, it continued up into the 20th century and was even mentioned in Merck's manual, the famous pharmaceutical Merck. Merck talks about this. This medicine is known as mumia or mummia. Mummia is a cure-all. You sick? Take some mummia. You got a cut on your leg? Rub some mummia on it. Drink some mummia. You'll live longer. Your dingle won't do the doodle do. Mummia again. Well, what was mummia? My clever linguists may know that this word mummia sounds a little like mummy. That's for a good reason. See, mummia was ground up remains of mummies, of embalmed corpses. It started out with mummies that were being taken out of Egypt. When those started to run dry, they would embalm and desiccate remains in Europe, grind it up, and eat it, drink it, snort. I think they even snorted it and smoked it, used it as a salve. So while Europe was condemning these groups for cannibalism, they were actually practicing cannibalism. It's bizarre. It's bizarre to me. Another thing that I at least find very interesting that happens here is one of the groups that we have the most widespread records of acts of cannibalism from. And it's confirmed pretty well. It's not just rumor, is the Aztecs. Aside from the fact that they are, as far as we know, the most prolific practitioners of human sacrifice in human history. They like to eat the parts of the sacrifices. This was very normal to them. When the Cortez and the Spanish came, they were horrified by the human sacrifice. They were horrified by the cannibalism. They thought it was unthinkable that the Aztecs killed and ate people to honor their gods. The Aztecs had an answer to this, because the Aztecs were equally horrified by Christian European practices. Specifically, the Spanish were by and large Catholic. In Catholicism, for those of you who don't know, there's a concept called transubstantiation. During Mass, as almost everybody I would imagine knows, they give out wafers, communion wafers. These wafers represent the body of Christ, and this goes back to the Last Supper. According to official Catholic catechismic teaching, the wafer actually transubstantiates, goes from being merely a wafer to the literal physical flesh of Jesus Christ in the mouth of the practitioner. Same with the wine becoming the literal blood. So while the Europeans were disgusted by the human sacrifice of the Aztecs were disgusted by the idea of eating your god. Basically, I at least find a degree of irony in this. So again, cannibalism, people are horrified by the idea, but it happened. It even happened in Europe. And again, it didn't stop until much more recently than anyone would want to, I think, than most people want to imagine. There's a lot more I could go into about historical cannibalism, but I want to talk a little bit about contemporary cannibalism, survival cannibalism to some extent. Not a lot, because survival cannibalism really isn't. It's a different issue, and I'll get into why in a second. I would recommend that if you're interested in cannibalism, one of those sources, because I use more than one, because any source, no matter how good, can be unreliable. There's a very good book, and it's a lot of fun, called Eat Thy Neighbor, A History of Cannibalism. It was written by an acquaintance of mine, Professor Mark P. Donnelly. It's a little sensationalistic, but it does talk about the history of cannibalism, and it contains a number of examples I've talked about, based on his and his co-authors' research. Let me touch as well briefly on survival. Again, I don't want to get into great detail, but survival cannibalism is a real thing. Probably the most famous example to people of my age, because there's a movie about it when I was a teen in high school, I want to say, called Alive, is that there was a soccer team, I want to say. Let me see. There we go. So yes, Alive. It's the story of the Andes survivors. It was Uruguayan rugby team, not soccer. Reported Air Force Flight Air Force Flight 571s that crashed in the Andes Mountains on October 13th, 1972. These people were caught in the snow for days, for an extended period of time, and the food supplies ran out, and they were forced to turn to cannibalism to survive. This is a very difficult situation for anyone who's wound up in it. It's not the only example, of course. There's the famous Donner Party as well. They get caught along, I want to say, the Oregon Trail. But with the Andes case, they had very little food: 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of almonds, a couple of dates, candies, plums, and a couple of bottles of wine. divided into small amounts to make it last as long as possible. Um, but even with very strict rationing, they were out there for days. With no it was up in the mountains, on a glacier. There was no food. After a week, the food ran out. They tried eating bits of the airplane, like the leather of the seats and the continent inside, which unfortunately made them sicker. Eventually, they had to turn to eating each other. Specifically, they didn't go killing people for food. They would eat people who died in the plane crash and things like that. 16 people survived this crash, this whole sequence, and that is 72 days up in the mountains. What's particularly horrific here is these people were horrified by what they were forced to do to survive. They were absolutely disgusted by that. But the Pope actually had to personally come and pardon them because they thought they were damned forever because they'd eaten flesh. These were friends, these were relatives, these were classmates. They didn't want to do it, but they did what they had to do. All of them, in fact, and why the Pope specifically was involved is everybody on the flight was a Roman Catholic. This is horrible. There's a concept in ethics called survival ethics. It basically means that in a life or death situation, you do what you have to do to survive. I do not judge. I've never been in that situation, and I think it is arrogant of anyone to judge someone who's been in a life or death situation who's had to resort to cannibalism. Particularly when they didn't kill, and particularly as is often the case, when they didn't have to actually kill people, they ate people who died. And unfortunately, it was a plane crash. The reality is people died. There was exposure. They were in the mountains. People died. There's no way around it. It's not I wouldn't call it a moral act, but it's certainly not an immoral act. Not everything is moral or immoral. Some things just are. There's something else I should talk about before I touch a little bit on serial killers. This is probably going to be a shorter episode. Well, my health is doing much better. My leg is finally healed. The thing on my back I need to get removed is removed. I do have a little bit of a cough. Also, I need to eat. But there's another interesting thing you find in cannibals and cultures that practice cannibalism, and it's just about unique to them. It's commonly known as let's see. The technical term is spongiform encephalopathy. Or more specifically, it's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Which is very, very similar to what we know as mad cow disease. It is very interesting because Creutzfeldt-Jakob's, also known as CJD, is nearly unique to cannibals. It's a neurological disorder caused by prion disease. It's also a fatal degenerative brain disorder. And he had subacute spongiform encephalopathy. So one of the things that makes this interesting, aside from the fact it's primarily not exclusively found in cannibals, there's some evidence that it can also be passed in blood. Is usually when we talk about disease, it's caused by pathogen, germs, viruses, bacteria, or parasites. Creutzfeldt-Jakob's, much like the bovine form, mad cow disease, is not caused by those things. It's caused by a mutated protein, what's called a prion. To give you an idea of how serious this thing is, about 70% of people who get it die within a year, or correction, 70% of people who are diagnosed with it die within a year. Basically, it's misfolded proteins that are infectious. Particularly, what will happen is about supposedly looking at the Wikipedia, but 85% of the cases occur for no known reason. 7.5% are inherited from parents, and usually often one of the ways it will spread is exposure to the brain or spinal tissue of someone who already has it. So specifically, this is a disease that is prominent in cannibals who eat the brain of their choice. And yes, Vita, I'm doing pretty well. It's a minor cough. It's no big deal. It should clear up shortly. But yes, there is a disease. Symptoms of which are similar, actually somewhat similar to Alzheimer's, except the progression rate is generally much faster. Caused by eating human flesh, among other things. Again, you can inherit it. There seem to be other ways. And it's it's interesting, at least to me, because it's a mutation of a protein rather than the usual things that we associate with causing disease. There's no treatment. And no cure for Creutzfeldt-Jakob's. You get it, you're dying. It's the way. It's just the reality it works. As of 2000, even this year, still none. Some of the symptoms, like it'll cause twitching, can be treated, but it's really just it's treating the symptoms while the person dies. As of 1981, people are not known to have lived longer than 2.5 years with this disease. The CDC does monitor outbreaks of it within the United States. It occurs at about 1 case per million per year. Mortality, and studies of mortality from 79 to 94 bear out about one in a million people a year will die from this disease. It's also very rare in people under the age of 30, maybe 5 deaths per billion a year. It's most often found in people from the ages 55 to 65, but also happens in people older than 90 and younger than 55. But the last topic I want to touch on a bit is the most widespread modern form of cannibalism, which is cannibalism by serial killers. And hello, the Hornet. A number of serial killers throughout history, including some very prominent ones, have been most famously, of course, would be Jeffrey Dahmer. Were known to have eaten some parts of their victims. One of the more interesting cases, who is well known, but is not technically a serial killer, is Ed Gein. And people may wonder why I say he wasn't a serial killer. And he wasn't. So, that we know of, and this is what he confessed to, and most serial killers confess to more, Ed Gein killed 2 women. A tavern owner by the name of Mary Hogan in 1954, and a hardware store owner, Bernice Worden, in 1957. To qualify as a serial killer, you need to kill at least 3 people with a month cooling off period in between, or more, a month or more. This is a common thing a lot of people misunderstand. If you kill a lot of people in a very short period of time, you're a spree killer. If you kill a lot of people all at once, you're a mass murderer. What defines a serial killer isn't, as some people think, the modus operandi or the ritual. Many serial killers have a ritual about how they would kill people. Not all of them do. But it's you kill, you pause. You kill, you pause. And thank you, Vita. I appreciate that. He said, very interesting, and your name suits definitely walking encyclopedia on many subjects. For my newer listeners, many, many years ago, I worked with a man by the name of Lou Gentile, who was a dear friend and mentor, both the guy who taught me how to investigate the paranormal and who got me into doing radio and things of this nature. Lou used to fondly, because we were very dear friends, he teased me about being a walking encyclopedia. Sadly, he passed away in 2006. So when I finally decided to start doing this show myself, to honor him, that's why I call myself Paranormal Encyclopedia. I still consider it flattering, because Lou was, for those of you who don't know, was the last student to be taught by Ed and Lorraine Warren. And he knew his stuff very well, and he had many years of experience. But while I didn't have his experience, a lifetime of my nose being buried in weird books has left me with a lot of knowledge, which is kind of where this comes from. And kind of why I want to expand the show out a little. I love talking about the paranormal, but there's so many other fascinating subjects in the world that I love and I'd like to talk about that I could spend more time on. World War II and all the crazy things that happened. For those of you who don't know, for example, the country of Poland in World War II was actually pretty badass. They had a battle. Poland had a Thermopylae during World War II that is far infinitely more impressive than the actual Battle of Thermopylae. Maybe I'll tell that story when I get to the end. But I want to, or before I end this, but I want to finish up talking about Ed Gein in particular. So, like I said, Gein was not a serial killer. But the thing is, well, he only killed 2 people. He dug up and mutilated 9 corpses. He would eat their flesh. He would skin them and wear their skins. He was the inspiration both for Robert Bloch's novel Psycho, which was, of course, later turned into a tremendously successful movie by Alfred Hitchcock. He was the inspiration for Buffalo Bill in the movie Silence of the Lambs. He was the inspiration for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. As you may know, if you've ever seen the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they say that it's based on a true story. Ed Gein is the true story it was very loosely based on. Again, he killed 2 people and then dug up and skinned a bunch more. What's interesting, and this is common when you look at the psychology of modern day serial killers who eat flesh, is there's again very personally symbolic elements to it. To Ed Gein, for example, the women that he killed and the women, to some extent, I believe the women they dug up, he saw them as mother figures. So it was a way of making his mother part of him when he ate them. There's Jeffrey Dahmer also had a very big thing about consuming and domination of his victims. We know, for example, that he liked to drill holes in his victim's head and pour in sulfuric acid, not as a form of torture, but actually he was hoping to turn them into his zombie slaves. But there is this possessiveness and this control, and the cannibalism is very, in many ways, an aspect of that. Because even though the person's dead, some part of them lives on in you because you've eaten them and consumed them. There are a lot of more examples I could get into. I mean, and I will probably revisit this topic at some point, because I've done a bunch of research. I knew some things to begin with. But the more research you do, the more you realize there's more you don't know, which is one of the reasons I love subjects like this. I'm going to wrap up in a minute because I want to, I'm going to real quickly tell you guys the story of the Battle of Wisnia, which, like I said, is the Polish Battle of Thermopylae that is more the Battle of Thermopylae than the actual Battle of Thermopylae. So this happens during the Second World War. Specifically, it happens between September 7th and September 10th of 1939 during the German-Russian invasion of Poland. There is a town in Poland called Wisnia. It was under attack by something like 40,000 German troops. It was defended, reports differ, but the number was somewhere between 350 and 720 Poles. The position was partly fortified, and by partly I mean the fortifications were half finished. There's a couple of machine gun nests, some of which were just sandbags thrown into place, a couple of machine guns. But to give you an idea of how ridiculously one-sided this battle was, for every Polish soldier, there was 60 German soldiers and a freaking tank. They were ridiculously outnumbered. They knew they were going to lose, but they dug in their heels and fought. They proceeded to hold out for 3 days. Stalled out the German advance into Poland. We don't know the exact losses among the Poles because the reality was very little is known of which ones were taken as prisoner of wars by Germans, but it's estimated about 70 Polish soldiers. Of around 720, about 70 survived. Some were taken prisoner, others escaped to Polish lines. Some of the prisoners were later killed by Germans. Others were beaten, abused, and survived and taken to the POW camps. We don't know German losses either, other than the Wehrmacht mentioned several dozen dead, but at least 100 bodies of fallen German soldiers were exhumed from a local war cemetery. But this is the thing to realize about how badass Poland is. 3 days, outnumbered 60-1. They held out against the German invasion of Poland for 3 days, and the only reason they stopped fighting is they ran out of bullets. And the commander committed suicide rather than surrender the fort. I'll give you another real quick example of badassery with the Poles. And it's also worth noting, I might add, because this, in my opinion, makes what they did more impressive. Many of the 720 Polish soldiers were conscripts. They were forced to be there by the government, and they still fought that well. One of the stories you'll hear, and there's truth to this, but the reasons are wrong, is that during the invasion, the Poles actually charged German tanks on horseback. And people will paint this as, wow, the Poles are stupid. Why didn't they use artillery and tanks and conventional means of warfare instead of a cavalry charge against armed tank units? The reason why that, yes, it's a matter of history, the Poles charged German tanks on horseback using primitive weapons. The reason why they did that is they'd run out of ammunition for their better weapons. They weren't being stupid. They were that determined to keep fighting that they kept going with all they had left. That's impressive, not pathetic. There's a similar story that I always find fascinating with the I want to say the Satsuma Rebellion, although I may have it wrong, but if you've ever seen the movie The Last Samurai, it's loosely based on a pair of rebellions that happened in Japanese history in the 19th century, where basically the samurai caste of society rebelled against the government because they felt that their rights as samurai were being stripped from them. Um, the movie is mostly a work of fiction, but it's loosely based on actual history. In the movie, you see a very poignant and impressive scene of samurai in traditional armor, wielding katanas, charging artillery emplacements. And oh my God, wow, thank you, Vita. That's really, really appreciated. Saying that they could listen to me all night. I'm honored. And yes, near the very end of the one rebellion, samurai did charge modern weaponry with bows and katana and swords. This again is not as stupid as it's not stupid, it's badass. The reason why is the movie says that the samurai leader had, as a matter of honor, sworn off the use of guns. No, he didn't. Samurai were using guns in their history for centuries before the modernization of Japan in the 19th century. They ran out of ammo. They were that determined to keep fighting. That's why they went back to primitive weaponry, not because of stupidity or some outdated, some bizarre concept of honor. It was what they had left. And again, I would never advise attacking a modern military, well-armed and prepared military force with swords and bows. But if it's all you've got left, and you really, it's not as, it's less stupid than it gets made out to be. And that's the thing. There's so much more about history that you don't hear about. Another topic I've got coming up, and there's more I can say about Poland. I haven't even touched on WatchTech yet. Or in English history, wait until we get to Fighting Jack Churchill. Yes, absolutely true. Again, Vita's saying, very impressive. I have some Polish friends and they're tough. Not just physically, but mentally tough. Very determined. It's still instilled in them today. I don't know a whole lot of Polish people, but it doesn't surprise me. But there are so many crazy things. You want another subject that people don't talk about that I find absolutely fascinating? We're going to do an episode on the history of women in war. Women have been fighting longer than you might think. There are obvious examples. Jeanne d'Arc is an absolutely mind-blowingly amazing female figure in history. For anyone like me who hails from the cesspool of evil that is the state of New Jersey, you may have heard of Captain Molly or Molly Pitcher from the Revolutionary War. One of the two of which is actually was one of the first women to draw a military pension from the U.S. government, and this is from the Continental Congress. There's also the absolutely insane. If any Disney exec happens to listen to this, if you want a pro tip on a woman to make a movie about, Julie d'Aubigny. She was a French opera singer, bisexual duelist, who wrote, like, any of my fans out there who play D&D, if you've ever heard of the idea, the D&D idea of a bard, Julie was a freaking bard. I don't mean the weak little wimpy bards of earlier editions. I mean like the first edition bard that had to multi-class into 6 different things to be a bard, of the modern bards that are actually pretty effective. She rode around France, killing people in duels and singing and having love affairs. The woman's insane. I'll talk about her in an upcoming episode. It means it's very cool that you're from Britain. Love to have people further afield join us. So that's what's going on with the show. Is we're going to branch out into other topics. We're not abandoning the paranormal entirely. I just want to spread my wings a little and talk about other things I find fascinating that I think you'll find fascinating too. Because the world we live in is far crazier than anyone wants to give it credit for. I barely scratched the surface. Again, if you missed the comment in the beginning, and this is probably going to factor into next week's topic, everlasting poop pills. Antimony. The everlasting poop pills from the Middle Ages. It's saying we're going to talk about some of the history of quack remedies. And yes, they actually, they called them snake oil salesmen for a reason. It'll be a lot of fun. It'll be a little crazy. We're going to keep going. For those of you who do not know, the first or second weekend in April, this is currently up in the air because some very good friends of mine who are going to be guests reminded me of it since I had forgotten, because we were certainly doing it on the first weekend in April, but that's Easter weekend. But we are going to do, for those of you who were here with us last year, that was Wrath of Khan, the Corona Apocalypse. It's that time again, Wrath of Khan 2, the Khan Strikes Back. I am still working on guests. Some of the people that are confirmed so far, Virgo Triad, Chuck Chases the Facts, and a couple of other folks from the Watchdog community are going to come on and do a panel together. I'm really looking forward to doing that. There is also most of my good friends that have been on the show will be coming back. Patrick Thomas and John French are going to come back. I think we'll persuade them to read some of their fiction. Lilith, Lauren, her husband, Baron Mind are going to come in. If you don't know who any of these people are, I highly recommend looking them up on my channel. They're lovely people. They do some really cool stuff. You can also look up the sister channel. I'm going to be moving the videos from there over to here so that they're on both soon. Wrath of Khan. Let's see. Who else do I have that's confirmed? I've got, it looks like my friend Nigel Taylor, who was the lead singer for a band called Platform One, as well as being famous for cosplaying Professor Snape at a number of conventions, is joining us. He is a very cool dude and a very good guy. I'm looking forward to having him on. And I'm still working on finding people for this. It is going to be here on YouTube. It's going to be completely free. It's going to run for 2 or 3 days. Lots of cool people to listen to. Won't cost you a penny. Check it out. But that's going to do it for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure having you join me into this look into the long pork. If anyone doesn't know, long pork's an old name for cannibalism because humans are supposed to taste like pork. It's like, go figure that humans are the only thing in the world that isn't supposed to taste like chicken. But that'll do it for tonight. Remember, tune in next week, Monday, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 7. I should be back to doing regular weekly episodes. Don't hold me to that. You can keep an eye here in the discussion tab, or you can go to our Facebook page, the Paranormal Encyclopedia. If you do enjoy what I do, if you like this show, if you're interested in seeing more, please do me a favor. Like, comment, subscribe. If you hate this, feel free to give me a thumbs down too, for that, because that helps me out in the algorithm too. Share it around with your friends. If you have this is and will always remain free, but if you happen to have $1 or $2 that's burning a hole in your wallet and you got nothing else to do with it, you can consider going to my Patreon. Links in the description. It's patreon.com/demonology. Patreon.com/demonology. If you don't have the money, dear God, do I understand that? Times are tight with Corona. Again, like, comment, and subscribe. Still does me a world of good and won't cost you anything. If you have any ideas for future topics, ideas for guests, maybe you want to have a guest, maybe your house is haunted and you need somebody to help you out, email me. The email is in the description. Remember that if you need an investigation and I come out to your house, there is no charge for that now or ever. I am morally opposed to the idea of paranormal investigation groups like mine charging people to help them. And that is always the one basic piece of advice I give everyone. If you're having a trouble with the spirit and you're worried about it, and a group says they can help you for money, and to be clear, if you live 6 hours from me, I'll help. I'll help you, but I'll either try to refer you to a group that's closer, or I'm going to want you to give me gas money. I don't make enough to be driving all over the United. As much as I want to, I can't go all over the United States. But there's usually a group that's more local or something I can do. There's always something that can be done, and if you really don't have the money, there's something that can be worked out. This is about helping people, not about me getting rich. Trust me, there are more lucrative ways, even within the paranormal community, to get rich than doing YouTube channels and conducting investigations. But that is going to do it for tonight. Thank you all for joining me. And until next week, have a good night, everybody, and God bless.